Hello, welcome to the Feast of the Seventh Month, and in this video I'm going to deal with the Feast of Tabernacles. The Feast of Tabernacles. This is Sukkot. In Leviticus chapter 23, I think that's from verse 33, you see God says something about Sukkot. Says something about the Feast of Tabernacles. The Feast of Tabernacles, Leviticus chapter 23, and we go to verse 33. Then the Lord spake to Moses, saying, Speak to the children of Israel, saying, The 15th day of this 7th month shall be the Feast of Tabernacles for 7 days to the Lord. On the first day there shall be a holy convocation. God gives the details of why He wants them to do, why He wants them to observe this feast, and then He said the people are to live in booths. The people are to live in booths in this season. Verse 40 said, and you shall take for yourselves on the first day the fruit of beautiful trees, branches of palm trees, the boughs of leafy trees, and willows of the brook, and you shall rejoice before the Lord your God for 7 days. You shall keep it as a feast to the Lord for 7 days. It shall be established forever. You shall celebrate it in the 7th month. You shall dwell in booths. That's verse 42. You shall dwell in booths for 7 days. You shall dwell in booths for 7 days. Why? Verse 43 explains that your generations may know that I made the children of Israel dwell in booths when I brought them out of the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. So now this feast takes the Feast of Tabernacles, takes the whole of the 3rd week of the 7th month. Remember, this is the 7th month is a special month. And the foundation for that is what God did on the 7th day of creation. So, and when you look through the Bible, you see the 7th is separated from the 6 preceding it. So, that is the way it is. When God wanted Israel to march around Jericho, on the 7th day, they did something they did not do on the previous 6 days. So that's where the 7th is. In the account of the 7th day of creation, you see that God did not, God inspired those who assign chapter numbers to narratives that they must not put it together with the account of the first 6 days. In the breaking of the seals, those who assigned chapters, the breaking of the 7th seal didn't come close to the 6th seal. The 6th seal was opened in chapter 6 of Revelation. Then the 7th seal was not even opened in chapter 7. It had to be opened in chapter 8. Then the 7 trumpets came. The 6th trumpet sounded in chapter 9. The 7th trumpet did not sound in chapter 9. It didn't sound in chapter 10. It sounded in chapter 11. Because the 7th is unique. The 7th is sanctified. The 7th is set apart. The 7th is holy and set apart from the rest. So I want you to understand this. So when God calls His people to keep these 3 feasts in the 7th month, 3 weeks of the 7th month is given to feasts. The first, the Festival of Trumpets, Yom Teruah, and then the The second one on the 10th Yom Kippur, the 10th day of the seventh month. And then the 15th of the 7th month for 7 days is Sukkot, the Feast of Tabernacles. And then there are details, things that God wanted them to do in this season. But God said, I want your generations to know, as you celebrate these things, you're not going to do it in the comfort of your homes. You're going to dwell in booths for 7 days. You dwell in booths for 7 days. You're going to do it dwelling in booths. Why dwelling in booths? I want your people, the generations coming, to know that I made Israel to dwell in booths when I brought them out from the land of Egypt and I'm taking them to the promised land. I kept them in booths. Cold did not kill them. Heat waves did not kill them. I protected them. I provided for them. They had no permanent dwelling, but they did not lack anything because they were on the move. Why people on the move? So we have no permanent dwelling. When people on the move, God said, I just want you to commemorate that. Cast your minds back. Celebrate. God has a way of, getting us not to forget where we're coming from. You see, when you see people, when most problems come because people forget where they're coming from. When people forget where they're coming from, pride sets in. When people forget where they're coming from, that's why people can become wicked and never turn back. When people forget where they're coming, you remember the story of the man who's, in the parable that Jesus told about the unforgiving servant, how that his master forgave so much to him. And then he went out and saw another person who owed him much less than he owed his master. And he heard him say, you must pay me today. He just forgot where he was coming from. He forgot. He forgot where he was coming from. So God doesn't want us to forget. Yeah, I know there are portions of the Bible that say they don't remember the former things. Yeah, we shouldn't remember the former things if they won't help us in the present. But there are things we must not forget. We must not forget our roots. When the children of Israel took the tithes, they were to make a confession before the priest and said, a Syrian about to die was my father. A Syrian, each year, they take that offering to the priest, and before the priest they said, a Syrian about to die was my father. Why would God have them to make such confessions so you don't forget where you're coming from? There are people who had very humble beginnings, but then God lifted them up, and then, they're now living as if they never tested the grace of God. So God doesn't want us to forget. So God will get this people and say, look, I want you to keep this feast not for 1 day. You're going to live in booths for 7 days. 7 days. Can you imagine? Trumpets, Festival of Trumpets, 1 day. Atonement, 1 day. But when it comes to remembering the mercy of God, we need to dwell there. We need to dwell, spend time, dwell on the mercies of God, dwell on the love, on the kindness of God, dwell on the faithfulness of God. You're going to be here 7 days. Your children may say, when are we going? Say, no, we're here for 7 days. Why? We just want to commemorate that we lived in booths when we were coming out of Egypt. We lived in booths. We didn't live in the kind of homes we have today. And we lived in booths for 40 years, and we did not die. We lived in booths for 40 years, Sickness did not come. We lived in boots for 40 years. There was no pneumonia. We lived in boots for 40 years. We did not lack anything. When you remember where you are coming from, there are things it will do in your life. Always do something, help yourself to remember the past. There are things it will do. One, it will keep you grateful. I know where I'm coming from. I know where the Lord picked me from. David remembered when Saul's daughter was, mocking him for dancing before him. He said, I know where God picked me from. So I must show gratitude to God. While I live in my house of cedar today, I'm living in my paneled house. I'm comfortable, but I haven't forgotten that it was the mercy of God that took me from where I was to where I am today. So when you remember where you're coming from and you truly remember you're coming from, you will be grateful to God. Now, when you remember where you are coming from, you will be humble. These feasts will work humility. And children say, you mean we lived in boots for 40 years? Yes. We survived 40 years of living in boots. No permanent house, no permanent dwelling. We were just moving from place to place for 40 years. We lived in boots. We survived it. Oh, that means if we survived living in boots for 40 years through the help of God, that means God can even protect us more. God can protect us more. God can help us more. If he did that for us 40 years in the wilderness, he can do more for us now. But we're not even there yet. So it helps us to be grateful. It helps us to be humble. And thirdly, it helps us to be generous. When you remember where you're coming from, you are generous. God will tell the children of Israel, when you are picking up your harvest, don't pick everything. Leave some for strangers, because you too, you were strangers. As long as you keep remembering that you were once a stranger, you will be generous to the stranger, because you know you were there. So when we remember where we're coming from, you will remember the things you survived, the things God led you through, the things God helped you to overcome, the things God did not allow to destroy you. You will be great. You will be generous. You will see others who are going through the same thing. He said, come on, I understand what you're going through. God who saw me through will see you through, and I'm going to do whatever I can to see that, you don't have to go through everything I went through. I mean, you are generous because you know where you're coming from. When we don't know where we're coming from, you will beg people to give thanks. You will beg people to show gratitude to God. You will have literally begged them to express gratitude to God. When you know where you're coming from, nobody will teach you humility. You will just become humble. You'll become humble. Daniel was angry, was not happy with the son of Nebuchadnezzar. He said, you saw your father eat grasses as if he was an animal. You saw these things, and you're still walking in pride because you forgot where you're coming from. When we know where we're coming from, it helps us to become generous to those who are experiencing what we used to experience. And lastly, when you remember where you're coming from, it gives you hope for the future. That if God helped me to survive that, the same God can help me in the future. If God helped me to go through that, he is able. If God helped our fathers to survive, we can trust the same God that in these times when enemies are all around, while Israel lived in booths, enemies were all over the place, but God protected them. If God did this for our fathers, so we, reflect in the season of this Feast of Tabernacles, we can look back and say, if God did that for our fathers, our safety is not the Iron Dome. Thank God for it. Our safety is not the interceptors. Our safety is not in the weapons that we've amassed. Our safety is not in the experience we've gathered. Our safety is not in our allies, as good as these things are. Our safety and our help is in the name of the Lord, who kept our fathers through the wilderness, living in booths for 40 years. So this year, as you reflect on the Feast of Tabernacles, think of the goodness of God. Think of the mercy of God. Think of the faithfulness of God. Think of the generosity of God. Think of God's love. Think of the power of God. Think of the wisdom of God. And just say to yourself, the God who did that before, he can do it again. If our fathers trusted him, we can trust him. He never fails. I pray that God bless you and gives you a happy 7th month as you go through this holy season, a biblical holy season. God bless you. Amen.